Today I'd like to talk about the Anglo-Zanzibar War. It's the shortest war in history, but just because it's so short doesn't mean it wasn't without consequence or casualties. Zanzibar is only a small island off the east coast of Africa, but it was one of the hubs of the Indian Ocean trade. The explorer Richard Burton described how, as you approached it, the first thing you would smell was the heavy perfume of cloves. But then, once the sun set and the winds changed, a different smell would assault your senses. This was the smell of decay and of rotting flesh, because Zanzibar didn't just trade in spices. Once Britain had eliminated the Atlantic slave trade, it expanded its crusade to cover the east coast of Africa as well. This made Zanzibar one of the most important targets. As British interest in Zanzibar grew during the 1870s to the 1880s, their attack on the slave trading shook the ruling classes of the Sultanate, especially the Arab aristocracy. From 1884 through the 1890s, Britain subjected the slave trade to a systematic attack. They pressured other European powers to also oppose the trade through an international conference in Brussels in 1890. They were even willing to swap the strategically important island of Zanzibar with the Germans in order to secure Zanzibar within their own sphere of influence. Hostility was growing within the Sultan's court among the aristocracy towards the British. The Zanzibari ruling classes knew that if the British ever got their way and abolished the slave trade, that would mean the ultimate collapse of the Sultanate itself. They did not want to lose their power, or even worse, their wealth. The spreading influence of British and German commercial interests was eroding Sultan Sayyid Ali's power. While Britain tightened its grip on the still independent Sultanate of Zanzibar, the Arab Swahili slave traders in the Sultan's mainland territories were often friendlier with the Germans, as they were less likely to crack down on slave trading than the British were. In 1895, just after Sayyid Ali's death, the coronation of Hamid bin Thwain, Zanzibar and its neighbouring island of Pemba had a population of about 400,000 people. 268,000 of them were enslaved Africans. Free labour was practically unheard of, with everything done by enslaved people. At 11:40 a.m. on the 25th of August 1896, Sultan Hamid bin Thwain died suddenly. He was only 40 years old, and it looked like he had been poisoned. The main suspect was Sayyid Khalid bin Bargash, who immediately took over the palace and tried to occupy the throne. Khalid had been born in Zanzibar in 1874 as the second of the two sons of Sayyid Bargash. Bargash did not particularly like the British. He had once been forced to flee Zanzibar town dressed as a woman after they had thwarted his coup against his half-brother Majid. By 25, Khalid had already earned a reputation as a rash and willful young man. He had inherited his father's temper and cruelty, but without his intelligence. He had also inherited a dislike of European reforms. But because of this, he enjoyed his people's support, and had become a symbol of resistance against foreign interference. Basil Cave, the British diplomatic agent in Zanzibar, arrived at the palace within 10 minutes of the old Sultan's death, together with General Matthews. They warned Khalid that the British would not support him. Khalid brushed them aside, as forces loyal to him were already starting to muster in the palace square. Unfortunately for Khalid, these were not the only troops on the island. The Royal Navy had been a permanent presence on Zanzibar for years. It was there to crack down on the slave trade, which was still continuing along the east coast of Africa, rather than meddle in the shifting sands of the Sultanate's politics. But within 15 minutes, the first shore party had been landed. They joined up with troops loyal to the British-controlled government. All the British women and children on the island were evacuated to the consulate, which was guarded by British sailors, under the command of Lieutenant Watson of HMS Thrush. Another British ship, HMS Sparrow, entered the harbour and was ordered to anchor alongside the Thrush opposite the palace. Then, at 2 p.m, they were joined by HMS St. George, the flagship of Rear Admiral Henry Rawson, the commander-in-chief of the Cape and East Africa Squadron. The Admiral's arrival had nothing to do with the coup. He did not even know what was going on when he'd chosen Zanzibar as next port of call. He did not intend to go anywhere dangerous, as he had his wife, his son, and the boys' governors on board. They were joined by a number of European ladies who were taken to HMS St. George for their safety. Others took refuge on a ship of the British India Steam Navigation Company. The rest of European residents in the town barricaded themselves inside their homes to protect their property from looting. At 4:30, the Arabs inside the palace buried Hamid bin Thwain. Shortly after that, Khalid declared himself to be the new Sultan. The British refused to recognise him. Their flag remained at half-mast in mourning for Sultan Hamid bin Twain, as did those of all the foreign consulates who followed their lead. Khalid ignored this insult and continued to assemble his troops. They lined up behind field guns that had been presented to Zanzibar by the German Emperor. At sunset, his force had swelled to 2,500 soldiers, with two 12-pounder field guns and one Gatling gun, as well as an ancient but still usable bronze cannon from 1658. That night passed in an uneasy peace. Sentries tramped their posts in full view of each other. A Zanzibari machine gunner sat behind his weapon, which he kept trained on the English club. And the artillerymen lay beside their guns, ready to spring up and into action at a moment's notice. At 10 a.m. the next morning, another British warship, HMS Raccoon, arrived and dropped her anchor in line with HMS Thrush and HMS Sparrow. Then Admiral Rawson sent Khalid an ultimatum. He ordered the self-proclaimed Sultan to haul down his flag and leave the palace by 9 o'clock the following morning, or he would be blasted out. The minutes dragged by that night in an unnatural silence. At 6 o'clock in the morning, on the 27th of August 1896, HMS St. George landed 2 more Maxim guns. At 8 o'clock, their boats returned, carrying more British subjects, seeking protection on the British warship. While they settled in, the sailors manned their guns. At 8:30, Khalid sent an envoy to the British consulate. He told the consul that the Sultan would not haul down his flag, as he did not believe the British would open fire on them. The consul simply repeated his ultimatum, as at that very moment the men of HMS Thrush were manning their starboard battery and getting ready to bombard the palace. The British sailors were not the only ones getting prepared to fight. At 8:45, the crew of the Sultan's royal yacht, the Glasgow, was getting ready to attack HMS Philomel and St. George. At 9 o'clock in the morning, on the 27th of August, 1896, the heady smell of cloves that hung over the harbour was joined by another smell, the smell of gun smoke. HMS St. George and Philomel fired at the Glasgow, while the others concentrated on the Palace and shore guns. At 9:03, the Glasgow fired back. 2 minutes later, Thrush and Raccoon fired on her. The Glasgow had been built as a gift for Sultan Bargash, who had particularly been impressed by a British frigate of the same name. But instead of a warship, he had been given a vessel with all the beauty and elegance of a royal palace. This was not what he wanted. He had returned to his own palace in silence. She had remained at her moorings ever since. She was armed. Pirates had been a serious problem in Zanzibar around the time Khalid's father had attempted his coup, but her outdated muzzle-loading guns were no match for modern breech-loaders ranged against her. She was holed along the waterline and began to settle at the stern. By 9:25, her guns had been silenced, and her crew hoisted the British flag as a token of surrender. A picket boat was dispatched from the Philomel to rescue her crew. They tried to save the ship as well, but by 10:45 she had sunk, leaving just her mast and funnel visible above the surface. Thrush, Raccoon and Philomel fired on the Palace. With her first shot, HMS Thrush dismounted one of the 2 12-pounders that had been positioned nearby. Khalid had bragged that he would rather die in the Palace than leave it. Almost as soon as the gun started to roar, he scurried out the back door, along with 40 of his followers. They left their slaves behind to do the fighting and dying for them. The palace was not a stone citadel. It was a flimsy wooden structure made of elegant balconies and verandas. The impact of high explosives and shell splinters simply tore it apart. At 9:30, the centre of the palace in Harim collapsed. 5 minutes later, Khalid reached the German consulate and begged for asylum. Out in the harbour, 2 steam launches tried to take on the mighty British warships armed with nothing more than rifles and muskets. If a vessel's power came from the bravery of the crew, they would have been unstoppable. But it doesn't, and they too joined the Glasgow at the bottom of the harbour. HMS Thrush ceased fire at 9:40. Raccoon ceased firing a minute later. Philomel and Sparrow continued until 9:45, but by then there was nothing left to shoot at. In less than an hour, the shortest war in history was over. The palace was on fire, Khalid's flag was gone, and he himself was hiding in the German consulate. The The British gunfire had been so accurate that no other building of the town were damaged. The British consul's preferred sultan was installed in a still smouldering palace, now totally dependent on the British for his throne. Only one petty officer from HMS Thrush had been severely wounded. He recovered, but left the service after they returned to Britain. On the other side, 500 people died in the scorched wreckage of the palace, while Khalid cowered in the German consulate. Next week, I'm going to talk about a few of the consequences of the shortest war in history. So if you'd like to hear about that, then please like and subscribe, and maybe the algorithm will show it to you. Otherwise, thank you for listening this long.